The next movement is into the 59th gate, the gate of dispersion and the gate of our sexual roles in life. And as such, it is one of the role gates and it's one of the profiling gates. This is where our genetic imperative is to reproduce. And this is the genetic strategy for reproduction that is inherent in each and every one of these lines. That is, it is specific to its purpose, reproduction. It's also part of the right angle cross of the sleeping phoenix. And this right angle cross of the sleeping phoenix is made up of the 59 and the 55. And of course, the 55 gives this cross its mysterious name. That is the 55 where the next mutation will take place in terms of the awareness process in humanity in the solar plexus, and the 20 and the 34. This is obviously a cross that is also a cross that is defined. And it's also a cross that has a great deal of individuality to it. 3 of the 4 arms are individual in nature with the exception of the 59. Mating. The ability to break down barriers to achieve union. That is the genetic strategy, to break down barriers to achieve union. 59-6 people are the great penetrators of auras. That is their gift. You cannot keep them out of an aura. When you're looking at the structure of a hexagram, we have seen that all first lines represent the foundation or the base of the hexagram and are lines of introspection, of looking inward. The 59-1 is trying to figure out whether intimacy or not is necessary, is trying to figure out what real intimacy is. But all first lines carry the quality of authoritarian that we saw in the 7. And by that very nature, this is intimacy my way. The first thing to recognize is that because we are dealing with the hexagram structure, the lower trigram, which has a personal destiny, the lower trigram is not aware of its social connections, is not aware of the gate at the other end of the channel. As such, in this very social and most intimately social of all channels, in the lower trigram, we still do not have an easy time with dealing with the other, because we're not ready for them. The first line is called the preemptive strike. In human design and sexuality, this line is referred to as the caveman line. You see what you want, you realize you need a mate, you go out there with your club, you whack them on the head, and you take them home. The boss. The sun exalted. The authority and vitality, you can see the word authority is in the line itself. The authority and vitality that in understanding purpose and direction can recognize and eliminate barriers before they become impregnable. Go get them, hit them on the head, take them home. The power of fertility to impregnate. Now please understand something, that the caveman always has in the geometry its cave woman, who is ready to play the same game. This is a wave of weakness and strength. It is one of the most important things to understand about our genetic design when it comes to continuing our species, that the strong is intended to mix with the weak. That based on our genetics through the duality, we're always interested in what we're not. If the strong only mate with the strong and the weak only mate with the weak, you have disaster in the gene pool. There are attributes in weakness that become strengths at different times. And there are attributes of strength that become weakness at other times. So it's always essential to have that balance. Mercury in detriment in this position the ability and intelligence to recognize, but a deep indecisiveness about how and when to act. The potential of fertility limited by uncertainty. The uncertainty is whether you really need the intimacy or not. It's so important to understand that about first lines. You know, the first line is just occupied in understanding its nature. It isn't occupied with either empowering or sharing or supporting others with that nature until it sees that it's necessary and that it's valuable. So the caveman has two sides. One side is you recognize what you need and you go and get it. And the other side is you recognize what you need, but you don't know when to go and get it. And of course, all of that is because you don't know the other. And hitting somebody over the head isn't knowing a hell of a lot about them. So these are the kind of beings that when you bump into them, they break into you intimately because they can break into your aura. The second line, shyness. Second lines don't know what's going on. They're involved in their process. They don't know that they have a sexual strategy. They don't know that by being in their own space, away from everything else, and because that own space of theirs is conditioned by being in a gate of intimacy, that everybody thinks they have a problem with being intimate. You know, they look through the window and they see them all alone and they say, "Aw, the shy one. We're going to have to go and get them out and invite them to the dance." Now, it's very important to see that this is a strategy. It is not a problem. Shyness. Self-imposed barriers. A preferred and natural separateness that protects against the inevitable instability engendered by union. The restriction of the sex drive to maintain separateness. Now, the first thing to recognize about the shy one is that they have to be called to intimacy, like all second lines. But that does not mean that it's going to work. Everyone who carries a second line always has a second line being called, but it's called by different forces. Some of the calls will lead you to a path of disturbance, and some of the calls will lead you to a path of relative peacefulness and success, whatever the polarity is. It is about how you enter in. And it always comes back to the same thing. If you're not living out your definition and type and authority, you cannot live out properly any of the lines that are a part of your design. You can't. And so what happens is that if you are a first line, you keep on banging people over the head and it doesn't work. And if you're the second line, people keep on calling on you, and every time they call on you, you think that that's the answer, and it's not, and you really get hurt. Just because they call on you and say, "I like you, I'd like to bring you out," doesn't mean you automatically say yes. We just left the yes. It's about entering into the experience correctly according to your design, and then the response will be correct. By the way, that doesn't mean it'll be successful. It just means it'll be correct for you. A calculated shyness rooted in deep psychological barriers that even in dynamic individuals will always restrict interaction. This is the Pluto in detriment. We have many of these people in the world. Many. Anyway, Pluto since the late 1940s, beginning in the 50s, Pluto in its movement and its transits has gone through both the 59th gate and the 6th gate. There's a whole generation of people born in 1959, 1960 that carry Pluto in the 59th gate. There's a whole generation about 10 years later that got it in the 6th gate. So this has had a lot of impact in our time. Infertility rooted psychologically or biologically, that conditions the drive for separateness. Now look, the difficulty that comes into the life of any second line is that they're not in control of who calls them out. And who's calling them out is recognizing them. All second lines are going to have difficulty in their process, because there is no way in which they can condition who calls them. They have to be very clear, though, about whether or not they can answer the call. In most human beings who are living out the not self, that answering of the call is never clear, and it's never according to their authority, and as such it leads to difficulties. It does not mean that somebody with a 59-2, in detriment, cannot have and give birth to a healthy human being. It's not true. But for the vast majority of humanity, now it is true, and there's no question about it. That is, these people do not want to be disturbed. In other words, they don't want to be fertile. They're in their own space. They don't even know that fertility is a question. And then they're called out. And remember that fertility, though it is basic in its biological meaning, it also means many other things. Being called out into that intimacy to give birth to something new out of that shared intimacy. Work, pleasure, whatever it happens to be. So many people are concerned about the nature of detriments. And it's so important to recognize that when you're living out your own nature, there is no exalted or detriment. That it's simply you, properly integrated into your totality, and a necessary aspect of what it is to be you. And 59-2s have no sexual problem. This is an assumption people make. It's their genetic strategy to be called out. And only when they're called out, and only when they answer that call according to their design, can they be fertile. Only then. And of course, that's very rare. Never forget that this cross is the cross of the sleeping phoenix, and that how it appears on the surface isn't what it truly is. That shyness is a projection. One does not know what lies underneath. You can find yourself with somebody who's very wild and quite outrageous. And all along you thought they were shy and meek, and you get overwhelmed by them. So this is a cross where things are not quite what they seem. A calculated shyness rooted in deep psychological barriers that even in dynamic individuals will always restrict interaction. This is the Pluto in detriment. We have many of these people in the world. Many. Anyway, Pluto since the late 1940s, beginning in the 50s, Pluto in its movement and its transits has gone through both the 59th gate and the 6th gate. There's a whole generation of people born in 1959, 1960 that carry Pluto in the 59th gate. There's a whole generation about 10 years later that got it in the 6th gate. So this has had a lot of impact in our time. Infertility, rooted psychologically or biologically, that conditions the drive for separateness. Now look, the difficulty that comes into the life of any second line is that they're not in control of who calls them out. And who's calling them out is recognizing them. All second lines are going to have difficulty in their process, because there is no way in which they can condition who calls them. They have to be very clear, though, about whether or not they can answer the call. In most human beings who are living out the not self, that answering of the call is never clear, and it's never according to their authority, and as such it leads to difficulties. It does not mean that somebody with a 59-2, in detriment, cannot have and give birth to a healthy human being. It's not true. But for the vast majority of humanity, now it is true. And there's no question about it. That is, these people do not want to be disturbed. In other words, they don't want to be fertile. They're in their own space. They don't even know that fertility is a question. And then they're called out. And remember that fertility, though it is basic in its biological meaning, it also means many other things. Being called out into that intimacy to give birth to something new out of that shared intimacy. Work, pleasure, whatever it happens to be. So many people are concerned about the nature of detriments. And it's so important to recognize that when you're living out your own nature, there is no exalted or detriment. That it's simply you, properly integrated into your totality, and a necessary aspect of what it is to be you. And 59 twos have no sexual problem. This is an assumption people make. It's their genetic strategy to be called out. And only when they're called out, and only when they answer that call according to their design, can they be fertile. Only then. And of course, that's very rare. Never forget that this cross is the cross of the sleeping phoenix, and that how it appears on the surface isn't what it truly is. That shyness is a projection. One does not know what lies underneath. You can find yourself with somebody who's very wild and quite outrageous. And all along you thought they were shy and meek and get overwhelmed by them. So this is a cross where things are not quite what they seem. The third line, openness. You know, if you want to know why we have divorce, you don't have to go much further than the 59.3. And when I say that, I'm talking about being unaware of the mechanics. Here is where the bonds made and broken get their name. Saturn exalted, where the search for identity and security can only be achieved through the dropping of barriers in order to define oneself through union. That is, where one is empowered through union and intimacy with others. These are people that must have intimacies. But that does not mean for a moment that any of those intimacies can last consistently. And please note the consistently. In other words, the 59.3 operates at its best when it has an intimacy that can stop being an intimacy and resume being an intimacy at a later time. Then the intimacy can last a lifetime. And though the bonds are continually broken, the bonds can always be made again. And this is very important to understand about third lines. You know, whatever goes wrong in the third line process, you always start again. You can always start again. And it means that the moment that you realize that you can come back and start again, means you don't have to completely abandon what didn't work, what bond was broken. Mars in detriment, where openness is transformed into promiscuity and its attendant problems, where the drive for empowerment can lead to promiscuity. Remember that the 59.3 is not transpersonal. It doesn't know what's at the other end. It's just offering itself for intimacy. And that in offering itself for intimacy, it's trying to find an intimacy that will work for it, but it doesn't know much about the other. If you want to talk to somebody about human beings and their sexual trip, talk to line 3. Because they're going to find out all about it, because they're going to keep on bouncing into it. And when they get to the 6th line, they may have enough wisdom to be able to recognize what intimacy really works or not. It's this trial and error process. So many 59-3s have great difficulty in maintaining relationships until they understand that they need their space. In other words, they need to break the bond. You know, the working couple that don't see each other for most of the day actually spend conscious time together for maybe 2 or 3 hours. Great for a 59-3. You know, you can come together in your intimacy, you can break the bond, you can go out into your own individual life, you can have your process, and then you can come back and make the bond again. And then it works. But you have to be free to break the bond. That's another story. The ability to be intimate and what the core of real intimacy is can only be seen in the fourth line. The caveman is not about intimacy. The first line is about conquest, which is the basis of how our whole sexual dance, our whole mating dance began, through conquest. But the sophistication of intimacy begins with the upper trigram because you do have the transpersonal skills. Intimacy that cannot understand or begin to understand the nature of the other can never work. It can never work. The fourth line, by its very nature, is there to externalize intimacy, and it recognizes that the other on the other side will take intimacy in different ways. This is the least overtly sexual in terms of strategy of any of these 6 lines. You know, the second line, which hides from intimacy, can seem so sexy. Whereas the fourth line, which can transpersonalize intimacy, isn't sexy at all. I don't mean to upset anybody. Fourth lines are not sexy. I'm sorry. What to do? Brotherhood, sisterhood. Mother Teresa's line. But there's a joke in this, of course. It's a delightful joke. Is that being a friend, and the fourth line is about externalizing intimacy through the strategy of friendship. And the goal of that friendship is to get to the point of intimacy that sexuality may be possible. You know, you become friends with someone, and then one night when the two of you are really bored and one of you is really depressed, you make love. And you go from being friends to being lovers. Dangerous business, by the way, because the wave emotionally of friendship is kindness and meanness. And I always tell people who have the 59-4, every time you make friends with someone new, please understand that's sexual in nature. And remember that what you tell your lover, you do not tell your friend. And what you tell a friend, you would never tell your lover. So don't tell your friend more than you would want to tell your lover. And then if you do end up in a sexual relationship, it isn't going to turn nasty. You know, you make friends with somebody, you tell them about your 9 ex-marriages and, you know, your problems with your abused children and whatever, and then one day you end up in bed together and you start a relationship and your friend who's now your lover remembers all those stories. The dropping of barriers to union to establish a universal union. The power derived from non-sexual intimacy. Now, where the 59-4 is very difficult is in teenagers. I mean, it really is. And they need counseling for that, to be comfortable with that. You know, you have an attractive young man or woman, and they have the 59-4, and they each have so many friends from the opposite sex, but they don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. You know, they just have these friends, but they don't have that special relationship that all of those friends are telling them about. And this is very difficult for them. And of course, until they understand that that's their strategy, that's what works, to become their friend, to eventually get over that barrier. Mercury in detriment, an intellectual understanding that's rarely put into action, that is, where the idea cannot restrain the sex drive. In other words, it's very hard to play the friendship game, and sex always gets in the way. And of course, it's noticeable. But then again, it is a strategy. It still begins with the friendship, but there's a great deal of pressure built in to turn that friendship into something else. In the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of the fourth line, the design Sun and Earth changes its position and it moves away from being the 2034 to the 16 and the 9. So we have the juxtaposition cross of strategy, the 59, the 55, the 16, and the 9. And of course, this strategy is rooted in the 59-4 personality. That is, these juxtaposition people are fixed in this life. It is their fate in this life to make friends. Period. And the only real relationships they have in this life are out of those friendships, sexual or otherwise. And they are real masters of friendship. It's one of those things to notice about all juxtaposition crosses. These beings have a gift of being able to cross the barriers. They can be friends with the right and the left. They can reach over to either side, though never join it. So in that sense, they have intimacy without consummation. They're able to build this field of friendships, which can be very valuable depending on the nature of how their life turns out. But at the same time, great difficulty in translating that into a sexual relationship that works for them. The left angle cross is the left angle cross of spirit. And this left angle cross of spirit, there's two versions, one with the 59 as the personality sun, the other with the 55 as the personality sun. In this cross of spirit, we have the femme fatale or Casanova. This fifth line is the line of seduction, the general, remember? Now think about what the fifth line is really good for. You're horny as hell, and you project on that person that they're the one that can really help you out of that problem. And so you seduce them, and they seduce you, and so forth and so on, and away you go. The power to use love to break down any barrier, and given the sun's lightness, there is no negative connotation inherent in this description. That is the power of sexuality to attract others. Now, these are people that put off a sexual buzz, but it doesn't mean they're humming. Fifth lines are like that. And that they cannot be consistently sexual. That they have to go onto the farm and wait for the right moment to be able to, in somebody's time of crisis, to be exactly the right thing for them in that moment. Well, that's what it's like to be a fifth line. Think about human beings. The truth about intimacy is that you hit people over the head and you drag them into your life. But how everybody would like to see intimacy is seduction. You get it when you need it from exactly the right person, and everything's great. And of course, that's what we call Hollywood. I mean, this 59.5 is Hollywood. You walk across the room, you see the person, blah, 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 you change their life, blah, blah, blah. Uranus in detriment, where the negative potential of this power becomes evident, the gigolo, the adventurous, the power of sexuality expressed as sexual power. Well, what to do? What to do? Think about the dilemma, though, that comes with the fifth line that cannot perform according to projection. You know, fifth lines can really get a bad name simply because they don't fulfill somebody else's projection or fantasy. And when you get that at the sexual level, of course, that's something else. It also means that it will restrict the sexual life, because the sexuality will only work best at certain times of crisis, times when it's called upon, times when it can be practical. Practical. It's practical for me at this point in my life to make love to this one. It's practical. It'll bring this, and this. The cross of spirit. The sixth line. One of those greatly misunderstood lines, the one night stand. Now, from the knowledge that we've gathered about structure, we know what six lines do. They get into the nature of their hexagram, and they get into it early, and they get their fingers burnt, and then they back off, and they go up onto the hill, and they watch the movie. So the one night stand is something that's going to operate early in the life of the 59-6. In other words, the random sexual encounter. But if you meet a 59-6 later in their life, you're not meeting somebody who will be particularly sexually active. They can even be celibates. Simply not interested in sex at all, because all it leads to is problems. And that it is not found or seen or experienced an intimacy yet that is fulfilling enough that it can come down from its high hill and say, yes, I'll get down here on the mundane plane with you. You know, there can be an uncomfortable aloofness in the position of any sixth line. The tendency based on personality or circumstances. And again, it's an introduction line. It has to be learnt. Seducers are born that way. Based on personality or circumstances, to accept only temporary unions that may be otherwise impossible or dangerous to continue. The power for intimacy regardless, this is regardless of conditions, the Venus, the perfected relationship, whether for a moment or an eternity, and that's what the 59-6 is looking for. Give me perfection in the intimacy. In the way that we look at lines through their structure, we've seen that the lower trigram does not know there's a gate at the other end of the channel. That the fourth line of externalization and the fifth line of universalization, these upper trigram transpersonal gates, they know there's a gate at the other end of the channel. But the sixth sits on the roof of the house. And its perspective is greater. It sees the whole circuit. Think about what that means for the 59-6. It's not deciding whether the 6 at the other side is going to be a good sexual partner or not. It's saying, okay, let's take it for granted that this 6 is going to be a good sexual partner and that we're going to be able to have intimacy. What is going to be the result of that? Are we going to be able to make a living together? Are we going to be able to live in the right house together? Are we blah, 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 blah. Are we going to have the right community? Are the kids going to grow up and be healthy? You know, are they going to go to college? Will I be able to afford it? Can I retire to a gated community in the middle of nowhere and be safe until I die? That 59-6 is sitting up there and looking at the potential of intimacy and trying to figure out the whole program right to the end of the line. Are they going to bury me over here with a nice stone? It isn't so easy for them to step into intimacy because perfection is just not a matter of satisfying the intimacy. It's about what the byproduct will be through the whole tribal circuitry. So anytime you're looking at a sixth line, recognize that what's holding it back from committing itself is its point of view. It doesn't just see the gate at the other end. It's looking beyond that and saying, oh, you don't understand. It's not you, dear. I think you're very sweet, but you're going to make a lousy wife. You're going to bear me ugly children, and you're going to kick my dog. Forget it. I don't need this moment of ecstasy. So 6 lines, because of that perspective, that is the restrictive element for them. And of course, they learn that. They don't get it when they're young. Mercury and detriment. The basic drive to move on that seeks impermanency as a matter of course and not in response to circumstances. The drive for sexual and intimate diversity. And again, all 6 lines, whether you're looking at the exalted or detriment, will always get to the same place. They're always going to get to that place where they withdraw from the hexagram's process itself in order to examine it. And what they're examining are those other forces that are doing the same thing. They're trying to see that. They're trying to see what intimacy can really work. And they're looking and they're saying, is it the caveman? Is it being shy and being called out? Is that the way? Is it just being stupid and banging into it? Is it about making friends with people? Is it about seducing them? What is it all about? The 6 is sitting up there and saying, what is that all about? Which one works? And it's not about choosing that one is better than the other. It's about finding somebody who exercises any one of them that really shows them that intimacy is something that can work. And then they can make a commitment. And this is one of the wonderful jokes of the wheel. I love it dearly. The 59-6 sits up there and says, okay. It's possible that kind of intimacy with that kind of person, that kind of thing can actually work. And out of that can come all kinds of things. So what do I have to do next? I have to go to the 40th gate and learn to be alone. I have to go from the 59th gate of the genetic strategy to be sexual and go to the 40th gate of denial and masturbate myself. One of the great keys to intimacy.